This video is audio content only. It does not contain any video footage or images. If you are expecting visual content, please be aware. This is intentionally provided in an audio-only format. We recommend listening to the audio rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding. Welcome. Have you ever wondered if your name is a silent architect of your destiny? Today, we explore nominative determinism, the phenomenon where our labels seemingly dictate our paths. We'll journey from ancient Roman proverbs to modern psychological theories like implicit egotism, investigating whether names influence our careers, sculpt our faces, or are simply statistical coincidences. From Dennis the dentist to those who defy their names entirely, join us as we uncover the fascinating, often humorous connection between the identities we carry and the lives we lead. Chapter 1. Nomen est Omen. The historical evolution of nominative determinism. The idea that a person's name might be a silent architect of their destiny is a concept that has haunted human culture for thousands of years. Long before we had modern psychology or database analytics to track the trajectories of our lives, ancient civilizations sensed a profound, almost mystical connection between the labels we carry and the paths we tread. The Romans famously captured this intuition in the proverb Nomen est Omen, which translates to "the name is a sign" or "the name is an omen." For the citizens of Rome, a name was not merely a convenient way to address a neighbor or a legal requirement for a census. It was a predictive force, a small piece of poetry that hinted at the character or the future of the individual. We can see this play out in the history of the Roman Republic, most famously during the trial of a corrupt official named Gaius Verres. Verres was a man whose surname literally translated to male swine, and when he was brought to justice for extortion and plundering in Sicily, the legendary orator Cicero made sure the court did not miss the irony. Cicero argued that the official's disgraceful conduct simply confirmed his name, effectively using the man's own identity as a weapon against him. This was perhaps one of the earliest recorded instances of a public figure being scrutinized through the lens of their own name, though at the time it was viewed as a natural alignment of the universe rather than a psychological quirk. To understand how we arrived at our modern obsession with these coincidences, we have to look at the very mechanics of how humans have named themselves through the ages. In the pre-urban era, life was simpler, and so were our identities. People were often known by a single name, like the Anglo-Saxon Bjornhard. These names were chosen for their specific meanings, or given as nicknames that reflected a person's immediate reality. It wasn't until much later, following events like the Norman conquest in England, that surnames began to appear as a necessity of a growing society. At first, these were not hereditary. They were practical descriptors meant to distinguish one John from another. You might be John the son of William, becoming John Williamson. Or you might be defined by where you lived, such as John from Acton, becoming John Acton. Most importantly for the development of fitting names, many people were named after what they did. John the carpenter became John Carpenter. This created a world where names and professions were perfectly aligned, by design, not by coincidence. A village smith was actually a smith, and a tailor was actually a tailor. For centuries, these occupational names were hereditary because trades were often passed down through families. If your father was a weaver, you would likely become a weaver, and the name weaver would follow you both. However, as society became more mobile and the strict structures of the guild system began to dissolve, the link between a name and a trade started to fray. By the 14th century, we began to see records of individuals like Roger Carpenter the Pepperer, a man whose name suggested one life while his actual work involved the spice trade. The names became fossils of ancestral history rather than descriptions of current reality. Despite this practical shift, the belief that names carried a spiritual or moral weight persisted. In 17th century England, the act of naming a child was treated with immense gravity. It was believed that a child should strive to live according to the message contained within their name. Clergymen of the era argued that a first name should be like a thread tied around a finger, serving as a constant reminder of the errand the individual was sent into the world to perform. This was the era that gave us the classic Puritan names we still recognize today, such as Faith, Fortitude, and Grace. The hope was that by bestowing a good and gracious signification upon a child, they might be inspired to perform good and gracious actions throughout their lives. By the late 19th century, this fascination moved from the pulpit to the printing press. In 1888, the Kentish Notebook magazine published what is considered one of the first formal lists of apt names, documenting a series of professionals whose identities matched their trades with uncanny precision. The list included carriers named Carter, a hosier named Hosegood, an auctioneer named Sales, and a draper named Cuff. These observations suggested that even as the hereditary link between names and trades had long since broken, the universe seemed to be conspiring to reunite them through sheer coincidence. As the 20th century dawned, this ancient intuition began to find its way into the budding field of psychology. In 1911, the Austrian psychoanalyst Wilhelm Steckel coined the phrase Die Verpflichtung des Namens, or the obligation of the name. Steckel argued that there was a hidden psychological pressure exerted by a name, suggesting that an individual might feel a subconscious duty to live up to the literal meaning of their label. This theory was expanded upon by Carl Abraham, who proposed that the power of names might be rooted in the inheritance of traits. Abraham suggested that ancestors who were given fitting names, such as a particularly strong man being named Strong, might pass down the physical or temperamental qualities that made the name apt in the first place, leading to a lineage where names and traits remained aligned over generations. Some of the most influential thinkers of the time started to notice this compulsion of the name within their own circles. It was noted that many prominent psychologists had names that reflected their core theories. Sigmund Freud, whose name translates to joy in German, championed the pleasure principle. Alfred Adler, meaning eagle, focused on the will to power and the soaring ambition of the human spirit. Even Carl Jung, meaning young, was tied to a lifelong fascination with the idea of rebirth and the eternal youth of the collective unconscious. As the phenomenon gained more academic and literary attention, various thinkers attempted to give it a definitive title. The American columnist Franklin P. Adams is credited with coining the term aptronym to describe a name that is particularly suited to its owner. Decades later, in 1970, the scholar Roberta Frank introduced the term onomastic determinism to describe the way names might influence destiny. In 1972, the playwright Tom Stoppard used the phrase cognomen syndrome in his play Jumpers to describe the same occurrence. Later, in 1992, the researcher Frank Nusel suggested aptonym, dropping the R, as a more streamlined alternative. The literary world also embraced this power, using what scholars call charactonyms to give readers an immediate sense of who a character is. Authors like Charles Dickens and William Shakespeare used these label names as a historical naming technique to anchor a reader's expectations, creating characters whose names acted as a shorthand for their very essence. While these terms circulated in niche circles, the concept was suddenly thrust into the mainstream in the mid-90s by the science magazine New Scientist. In late 1994, the magazine's humorous feedback column, edited by John Hoyland, noticed a series of remarkably fitting names in academia. It started when the editors received a book about the polar regions written by Daniel Snowman. Shortly after, they came across a guide to subterranean London, co-authored by Richard Trench. The coincidence was delightful, but it was a third example that truly set things in motion. An article on the medical subject of incontinence published in a urology journal by two researchers named Splatt and Whedon. The editors invited their readers to submit more examples, and the floodgates opened. It was a reader named C.R. Cavonius who suggested the perfect term for it, Nominative Determinism. This phrase provided a framework for a phenomenon that people had been noticing for a lifetime but hadn't quite known how to categorize. The magazine began to document hundreds of cases that seemed to defy the laws of probability. They found a U.S. Navy spokesman named Mike Kafka tasked with answering difficult, labyrinthine questions about the Guantanamo Bay detention camps, and a spokesman for a police organization specializing in knife crime named Alfred Hitchcock. They even noted the authors of a book titled The Imperial Animal were named Lionel Tiger and Robin Fox. As the term gained popularity, the magazine also coined nominative contradeterminism to describe those whose names created a striking contradiction with their work, suggesting that for every person who follows the path of their name, there is another who seems to run in the opposite direction. This distinction moved the conversation from the realm of jokes into the realm of human behavior and cultural study. One of the most significant historical milestones in this field is the study of the Ashanti people in Ghana. The Ashanti have a long-held custom of naming boys after the day of the week on which they are born, with the belief that the day of birth dictates a child's character. Boys born on Monday, Kwadwo, are expected to be mild-mannered and peace-loving, while those born on Wednesday, Kwaku, are expected to be violent and aggressive. When researchers analyzed the records of local juvenile courts, they found a startling correlation. The number of violent acts committed by boys named after Wednesday was significantly higher than would be expected by chance, while the Monday boys lived up to their peaceful reputations. This suggested that when a society attaches a specific expectation to a name, the individual often grows to fill that mold, providing a cultural anchor for the theory of nominative determinism. The power of names even appeared to extend to the very initials we carry. In the late 90s, a landmark study suggested that the symbolic power of initials could have measurable effects on health and longevity, marking a major milestone in the scientific investigation of how our identities might influence our physical lives. Whether these alignments are the result of some deep psychological pull or just the sheer law of large numbers in a world of billions of people, they reveal something fundamental about the human experience. We are pattern-seeking creatures who want to believe that our identities are not just random labels but meaningful parts of a larger story. This fascination has led to an entire subculture of name collecting, with columnists in major newspapers spending decades reporting on reader-submitted gems like piano teachers named Patience Scales or tax accountants named Shelby Goldgrab. As we move from the historical and anecdotal into the modern era, the question becomes less about whether these coincidences exist and more about why they happen. Is it possible that we are all, on some level, falling in love with the sounds of our own names and letting that affection guide our most important life decisions? This internal preference for the self and its symbols is a psychological force that researchers have only recently begun to map with precision. Chapter 2. The Echo of the I, Implicit Egotism and the Name-Letter Effect. While the historical and anecdotal evidence for nominative determinism provides a gallery of amusing coincidences, modern psychology seeks to understand the internal engine driving these patterns. The most compelling explanation suggests that we are not being steered by a whimsical fate, but rather by a deep-seated unconscious bias known as implicit egotism. This theory posits that most people have a fundamentally positive association with themselves. Because our names are the primary labels for our identities, that positive self-regard naturally spills over onto the letters and sounds that comprise our names. We do not just carry our names, we inhabit them, and in doing so, we develop a quiet, persistent preference for anything that reminds us of who we are. This phenomenon was first brought to light in 1985 by Joseph Nutten, a psychologist in Belgium who noticed something peculiar about his own behavior. He realized he had a strange fondness for car license plates that happened to contain the letters of his own name. This observation led to a series of experiments across various languages and cultures, confirming what is now called the name-letter effect. When people are asked to rate the beauty or appeal of the letters in the alphabet, they consistently rank the letters found in their own names, especially their initials, higher than other letters. This is not a conscious choice. If you asked someone why they liked the letter J, they would not likely say it is because their name is James. The preference operates entirely below the surface of conscious thought, a silent hum of self-attraction that influences our tastes in ways we rarely stop to analyze. To understand why this happens, psychologists distinguish between the name letter effect and the more general mere exposure effect. The mere exposure effect suggests that we grow to like things simply because they are familiar to us. We prefer the music we hear on the radio every day or the route we take to work because the brain finds comfort in the known. However, implicit egotism goes deeper. It is not just that we see our names frequently. It is that our names are inextricably linked to our sense of self-worth. We value the letters in our names because they belong to us. This is often explained through the mere ownership effect, which suggests that we tend to value objects, ideas, or even symbols more highly simply because they are our personal property. Our names are the ultimate piece of personal property, and the warmth we feel toward them acts as a psychological nudge. However, this internal magnetism is not universal. A crucial nuance was discovered by researcher Raymond Smeets, who found that the name letter effect is tied directly to an individual's level of self-esteem. While most people exhibit a preference for their own initials, those with low self-esteem actually gravitate away from self-related choices. If a person's internal association with themselves is negative or fraught with doubt, the echo of their name no longer carries a pleasant warmth. Instead, they may subconsciously avoid things that remind them of an identity they find painful or inadequate. This finding reinforces the idea that the name letter effect is not a mechanical quirk of the brain, but a reflection of our internal emotional landscape. For the majority of people, however, this subtle magnetism extends far beyond picking a favorite letter. It can manifest in the most significant decisions of our lives, from where we choose to live to the careers we pursue. In one extensive analysis of residential records in the United States, researchers found that people are disproportionately likely to live in cities that share a phonetic or alphabetical link to their own names. Women named Virginia were found to be overrepresented in Virginia Beach, while those named Georgia were more likely to move to the state of Georgia. Similarly, men named Louis showed a statistically significant preference for St. Louis. These individuals are not consciously moving to these locations for the sake of a pun. Rather, the name of the city feels right or familiar in a way that bypasses logical scrutiny. This geographic pull is mirrored in our professional lives. The most famous example in psychological literature involves the names Dennis and Denise. Statistical analyses of professional databases revealed that people with these names are overrepresented in the field of dentistry. The logic suggests that a young Dennis, repeatedly seeing and hearing a word that shares the first several letters of his own identity, develops an unconscious comfort and familiarity with the concept of dentistry. The same pattern has been observed with other professions. People named Lawrence or Laura are more likely to become lawyers, and those named George or Jeffrey are disproportionately found in the geosciences, such as geology or geophysics. These choices represent the ultimate manifestation of implicit egotism, the alignment of one's lifelong labor with the very syllables of their identity. The influence of the name letter effect is perhaps most visible in low-stakes or highly emotional decision-making, where the conscious mind is less likely to intervene with rigorous logic. A fascinating study of disaster relief found that people are significantly more likely to donate to hurricane relief efforts when the hurricane shares their initial. A person named Catherine might feel a sudden, inexplicable surge of empathy for the victims of Hurricane Katrina, leading her to open her wallet more readily than she would for Hurricane Andrew. This is not a rational calculation of need. It is a moment where the self-concept is triggered by a linguistic match, turning a global tragedy into a personal connection. This same magnetism influences our daily purchasing behavior. We are more likely to buy products, choose brands, or even prefer crackers and chocolates that share our initials. If a consumer named Peter is standing in a grocery store aisle, he may find himself reaching for a brand that starts with P, without ever realizing that his choice is being guided by a lifelong love affair with his own name. These small, cumulative preferences show that implicit egotism is a constant companion, a quiet advisor that helps us navigate a world of endless choices by pointing us toward the things that feel like us. However, the influence of a name is not just about the letters on a page. It is also about the very sounds those letters make when they are spoken aloud. Psychologists and linguists have found that different phonetic structures carry different internal connotations, which can shape how we perceive ourselves and how we expect to be perceived by others. For example, names with short, abrupt sounds, often referred to as plosives, tend to be associated with extroversion and high energy. Names like Katie or Jack, with their sharp endings, carry an internal staccato that can influence a person's self-perception as someone bubbly, outgoing, and assertive. In contrast, names that feature softer, flowing sounds, known as sonorants, carry a different psychological weight. Names like Owen or Lauren are often perceived as belonging to people who are natural peacemakers, agreeable and calm. These are not just idle stereotypes. They are part of a broader finding in linguistics that humans naturally associate certain speech sounds with specific physical or personality traits. If a name sounds smooth and soft, we subconsciously project those qualities onto our own identity. A person whose name aligns with the internal feel of their personality may find a sense of phonetic harmony that reinforces their self-concept, while a dissonance between a name's sound and a person's temperament can create a subtle, lifelong friction. To ensure these patterns were not just a quirk of small data sets, more recent research has utilized massive language models and artificial intelligence to scan millions of biographies and social media profiles. These high-tech deep dives confirmed that the name-letter association remains a stable force in the real world. Even when researchers controlled for factors like gender, ethnicity, and the relative popularity of certain names in different decades, the link between a first name's initial and a person's major life choices persisted. This suggests that the psychological pull is not a relic of a specific time or place, but a fundamental aspect of how the human mind processes identity. Ultimately, the magnetism of the self means that we are always looking for reflections of our own identity in the world around us. Our names provide a constant, familiar signal in a noisy environment. Whether it is the phonetic comfort of a name like Dennis leading to a career in dentistry, or the emotional pull of a hurricane name triggering a charitable donation, the labels we carry are far more than just markers for identification. They are psychological anchors that help define our self-concept and influence our interactions with the world. But if these internal preferences are so powerful, how do they hold up when they collide with the cold, hard reality of statistical scrutiny and the skeptical eye of the scientific community? Chapter 3: The Statistical Ghost in the Machine. The human mind is a relentless pattern-seeking machine. We are hardwired to find meaning in the static, to see faces in the clouds, and to hear secret messages in the rustling of leaves. This tendency, which psychologists call apophenia, is what makes the concept of nominative determinism so intoxicating. It feels like a glitch in the simulation, a moment where the chaotic randomness of the universe briefly gives way to a clever, pun-filled design. But as the theory moved from the pages of humorous magazine columns into the rigorous world of academic research, a fierce debate erupted. Scientists began to ask an uncomfortable question. Is nominative determinism a genuine psychological force, or is it merely a statistical illusion created by our own biased observations? To understand the controversy, we must look at the cold, hard light of scientific scrutiny applied to the most famous studies in the field. The initial excitement surrounding the idea that a person named Dennis is more likely to become a dentist was built on what seemed like robust data. In the early 2000s, researchers like Brett Pelham looked at professional registries, compared the frequency of certain names, and found what looked like a significant overrepresentation. However, it wasn't long before other researchers, most notably the psychologist Yuri Simonson, began to poke holes in these conclusions, suggesting that the original studies had failed to account for some very mundane, non-mystical factors. Simonson's most devastating critique centered on what is known as the cohort effect. In any given society, names go in and out of fashion like hemlines or interior design trends. A name that is extremely popular for babies in the 1970s might be almost non-existent for babies born in the 1940s. When Pelham compared the number of dentists named Dennis to those named Walter, he found that Dennis was much more common in the dental profession. He concluded this was due to the phonetic similarity between the name and the job. But Simonson pointed out a glaring oversight. Walter is a name that was much more popular in an older generation. By the time the study was conducted, many of the Walters were retired or deceased, while the Dennises were in the prime of their professional lives. When Simonson reanalyzed the data, he found that Dennis wasn't just overrepresented in dentistry, he was overrepresented in almost every profession when compared to older names like Walter. Dennis was more likely to be a lawyer, a doctor, or an engineer simply because there were more Dennises in the workforce at that specific moment in history. Simonson further undercut the specific name-job link by demonstrating that names like George and Jeffrey were overrepresented in all sciences, not just geosciences. This revelation suggested that the apparent pull of the name was actually just a reflection of baby naming trends. Once you controlled for the age of the individuals, the dentist connection largely evaporated. This highlights one of the primary dangers in social science, confusing a correlation with a cause. This brings us to the pattern-hungry little goblin that lives inside the human brain. We are subject to a powerful cognitive bias known as confirmation bias. We are incredibly good at noticing the hits and ignoring the misses. When we meet a cardiologist named Dr. Hart, it is so memorable and delightful that we tell all our friends about it. We see it as proof of a cosmic hidden order. What we don't do is keep a mental tally of the thousands of cardiologists we encounter named Smith, Miller, or Rodriguez. Those names don't fit the pattern, so our brains simply discard them as irrelevant noise. Because the hits are so much more salient and shareable, they create a distorted perception of how common these coincidences actually are. This distortion is amplified by what researchers call publication bias. In the world of academic journals, a study that finds a surprising, counterintuitive result, like names predict careers, is much more likely to be published than a study that finds absolutely no connection. This creates a lopsided body of evidence where the only studies we see are the ones that claim to have found an effect. This makes the theory look far more scientifically established than it actually is. In fact, some research suggests the exact opposite of nominative determinism. A 2016 study published in the British Dental Journal by researcher J. Slay found evidence of what might be called nominative anti-determinism. After analyzing the UK Dentist Register, Slay found that dentists were actually less likely to have dentally related surnames than the general population. This directly challenges the Dennis the Dentist trope, suggesting that in some cultures or professions, people might subconsciously steer away from a name that feels too on the nose, perhaps to avoid a lifetime of predictable jokes. However, the fact side of the debate has its own heavy hitters. While the Dennis-dentist link might be shaky, other statistical effects appear more robust. A 2006 study by economists Liran Einav and Liat Yariv found a documented alphabetical advantage in academia. They discovered that economists with surnames earlier in the alphabet are significantly more likely to get tenure at top-tier departments, are more likely to be fellows of the Econometric Society, and are even more likely to win Nobel Prizes. Because citations in economics are often listed alphabetically, those with A names receive more visibility and top-of-mind awareness from their peers. This isn't a psychological pull toward a career, but a structural bias that rewards the luck of the alphabet. Further support for the fact camp comes from a 2013 study published in the British Medical Journal regarding the Brady Bunch. Researchers found that people with the surname Brady were 2.27 times more likely to require pacemakers for bradycardia, a condition characterized by an abnormally slow heart rate than the general population. While this could be a coincidence, the statistical significance was high enough to give even the most hardened skeptics pause. Modern technology has also entered the fray. A 2023 study from the University of Utah used artificial intelligence and natural language processing to analyze millions of records. Unlike the smaller manual studies of the past, this AI-driven approach found consistent evidence of name-letter associations across massive data sets. This suggests that while individual examples like Dennis the dentist might be flawed, there is a subtle, broad-spectrum signal in the data that cannot be entirely explained away by cohort effects or bias. One of the most dramatic examples of this scientific tug-of-war involved the theory of deadly initials. In 1999, psychologists Nicholas Christenfeld, David Phillips, and Laura Glynn published a paper that sent shockwaves through the public. They had reviewed thousands of death certificates in California and concluded that a person's initials could literally determine how long they lived. They claimed that men with negative initials, such as DIE, PIG, or RA, died an average of nearly 3 years younger than people with neutral initials. Even more startling, they claimed that people with positive initials like ACE, VIP, or WIN lived more than 4 years longer. This suggests that while individual examples like Dennis the dentist might be flawed, there is a subtle, broad-spectrum signal in the data that cannot be entirely explained away by cohort effects or bias. The explanation offered was that these initials acted as a constant, symbolic weight on a person's self-esteem. If your very identity is labeled as pig, the theory went, the cumulative stress of teasing and lower self-worth would eventually manifest as physical illness. It was a perfect example of the symbolic power of names. However, a 2005 investigation by economists Gary Smith found that this pattern completely disappeared when the data was looked at through a different lens. Christenfeld and his colleagues had grouped the data by the year of death, which created a statistical artifact. When Gary Smith regrouped the same data by the year of birth, the deadly effect vanished. It turned out that certain three-letter combinations were simply more or less common in different eras. For example, the initials VIP were non-existent in the early 19th century because the term very important person hadn't been coined yet. The differences in lifespan were actually due to broader social and medical improvements over time. People born later lived longer, and they also happened to have different popular initials. This case serves as a cautionary tale about how easily a compelling narrative can be built on a foundation of shaky statistics. Another major challenge to the theory comes from the history of our names as occupational fossils. A person named Baker might be a baker today, but we must consider the confounding variable of family tradition. In many cases, the destiny is not in the name, but in the family trade that the name represents. Even though we like to think of ourselves as free agents, we are often influenced by our family's social class and professional networks. If a family of lawyers has carried the surname Law for generations, the driver is the environment and the resources provided by the family, not the letters LAW. However, some researchers have proposed a biological explanation that bridges this gap. This theory posits that if your ancestors were selected for a specific trade because they had the physical attributes to succeed in it, those genes might still be present. A 2015 study by Martin Voracek and colleagues investigated this genetic social hypothesis. They found that people with the surname Smith still reported an above-average aptitude for activities requiring physical strength, while those with names like Taylor showed a trend towards superior fine motor skills and dexterity. In this view, nominative determinism isn't about the symbolic power of the letters. It's about the fact that your name is a label for a genetic lineage. You aren't a Smith because you like the sound of the word. You're a Smith because you come from a line of people who were built to be Smiths. Skeptics also point to the problem of base rates. There are billions of people in the world and only a limited number of common surnames and professions. If you have a large enough population, the laws of probability dictate that you will eventually find someone whose name matches their job. It is a mathematical certainty that in a country of hundreds of millions of people, there will be a few dentists named Dennis. The existence of these individuals doesn't prove a psychological theory. It proves that if you flip a coin enough times, it will eventually land on its edge. This leads to the concept of simple coincidence. Some scientists argue that we are being seduced by the sheer volume of data available in the Internet age. We can now search global databases in seconds to find the most outrageous examples of fitting names, which makes the phenomenon feel much more prevalent than it actually is. We are effectively cherry-picking the universe for evidence that supports a fun idea, rather than looking at the vast majority of data that contradicts it. There is also the issue of social feedback. Some people with fitting names report that they were never even aware of the coincidence until someone else pointed it out. This suggests that for many, the name is an afterthought, a funny detail that the rest of the world notices but the individual ignores. On the other hand, we cannot entirely dismiss the power of social stimulus. Even if the name doesn't exert a direct psychological pull on the individual, it certainly influences how others see them. A recruiter might be more likely to remember a resume for a gardening job if the applicant's name is Rose. This external nudge from society can create opportunities and paths that wouldn't otherwise exist. In this sense, nominative determination is not an internal drive, but an external social force. The debate between fact and fiction touches on the idea of implicit egotism being a low-stakes influence. Some researchers suggest that while our names might influence small decisions, like which brand of chocolate we buy, they are unlikely to be the primary driver of major life-altering decisions like a career. Choosing a profession involves years of education and massive financial investment. To suggest that a person would undergo all of that simply because their name starts with the same letter as the job title is, in the eyes of many skeptics, an extraordinary claim that requires extraordinary evidence. This skepticism is further fueled by the existence of near misses. We find it significant when a person named Dennis becomes a dentist, but we don't find it significant when a person named Dennis becomes a doctor or a lawyer. If the name-letter effect were a powerful force, we should see Dennises clustering in all sorts of D professions, but the data often doesn't show that kind of broad pattern. The hits are often very specific and isolated, which points more toward coincidence than a systemic psychological rule. The controversy over nominative determinism ultimately serves as a mirror for the scientific process itself. It shows the tension between our desire for meaningful patterns and the rigorous reality of statistical data. It reminds us to be wary of our own biases and to look closely at the confounding variables that can make a simple coincidence look like a law of nature. Whether the effect is a genuine psychological pull, a genetic legacy, or just a trick of the light, it forces us to consider the many subtle, invisible forces that shape our identities. As we move past the statistical arguments and the debate over whether these patterns are real or imagined, we find that names can have an even more surprising impact on our lives. Beyond our career choices or where we live, there is evidence to suggest that our names might actually be sculpting our very physical presence. The way a name is perceived by society, the stereotypes it carries, and the way we respond to those expectations can eventually leave a mark on our faces and our health. A phenomenon that suggests our names are not just labels we wear, but molds we eventually grow to fit. Chapter 4. The Dorian Gray Effect. In the famous story of Dorian Gray, a man remains youthful while his portrait in the attic ages, absorbing every sin and every year of his life. In the real world of social psychology, researchers have identified a curious inversion of this tale. They suggest that our names, rather than a hidden painting, might be the silent artists slowly sculpting our physical features, our behavior, and our standing in society. This phenomenon, often called the Dorian Gray effect, posits that we are not just born with a label, we eventually grow into it, manifesting the social stereotypes and expectations attached to our names in our very flesh and bone. Perhaps the most startling evidence for this comes from the study of name-face convergence. Imagine you were shown a series of photographs of strangers and asked to guess their names from a short list of options. Mathematically, if you were just guessing, your accuracy should be quite low. However, when researchers conducted these experiments, they found that both human participants and computer algorithms were able to match the correct name to the correct face at a rate significantly higher than chance. This suggests that there is something about a person's face that actually looks like their name. The reason for this isn't mystical. It is rooted in the way we mirror the social expectations surrounding us. From the moment we are named, we are surrounded by cultural stereotypes associated with that label. This is a process of physical sculpting. We unconsciously lean into the social archetype of our name, influencing how we groom ourselves, the hairstyles we choose, and even the way we hold our facial muscles. Over decades, the constant social pressure of being an Elizabeth or a Jack dictates the lines that develop around our eyes and the set of our jaw. We are effectively wearing our identity on our faces, manifesting a look that society has collectively decided fits our name. These stereotypes are remarkably specific and consistent across cultures. Research by Amy Nomen and her colleagues has mapped out the warmth and competence ratings we instinctively assign to different names. A name like Elizabeth is often the gold standard, perceived as being high in both warmth and competence. Conversely, a name like Misty is frequently rated low in both categories, creating an immediate social hurdle for the bearer. Other names carry more nuanced baggage. Riley is often seen as warm but lacking in competence, while Ruth is viewed as highly competent but lacking in warmth. These aren't just idle perceptions, they are the blueprints that society uses to build its expectations of us. In some regions, these stereotypes are so pervasive they have earned their own clinical-sounding nicknames. In Germany, sociologists speak of Kevinism and Chantelism. These terms describe a documented bias where names like Kevin, Cindy, or Chantel are associated with lower socioeconomic status and behavioral issues. A study of German educators revealed that teachers often gave lower grades to students with these names compared to those with names like Alexander, Sophie, or Marie, even when the work was of identical quality. This bias extends into adulthood. On dating apps and in help-seeking scenarios, individuals with Kevin-type names face significantly higher rates of rejection and lower success in receiving assistance than those with more prestigious names. This sculpting process begins with the very sounds that make up our names. Linguists have long noted that humans associate certain phonetic qualities with specific personality traits. Sharp, abrupt sounds, known as plosives, are found in names like Jack or Katie. These are often linked to quick, bouncy energy and extroversion. On the other hand, names with softer, more sonorous sounds, like Lauren or Owen, are naturally linked with agreeableness and a peaceful nature. These phonetic first impressions can be incredibly consequential. In studies where participants were asked to rate the personality of a stranger based solely on their name, those with softer-sounding names were consistently rated as more trustworthy and likable. The social standing conferred by a name is perhaps nowhere more visible than in the world of professional recruitment, where names act as structural barriers. In a Landmark study, researchers sent out identical resumes to thousands of job postings, changing only the names at the top. Resumes featuring names perceived as traditionally white, such as Emily and Greg, received 50% more callbacks than those with names perceived as traditionally black, such as Lakeisha and Jamal. This demonstrates that the Dorian Gray effect is not just about personal growth or facial lines. It is a force that dictates a person's economic trajectory and social mobility regardless of their actual skills. The weight of this social pressure is so profound that it often forces a radical choice upon those entering a new culture. For many immigrants, the desire to assimilate and the need to shield themselves from the sting of ridicule or systemic bias leads to the legal abandonment of their birth names. By adopting a more local or neutral label, they attempt to bypass the immediate stereotypes that might otherwise stall their progress, choosing a new mask in hopes of a smoother social integration. This preemptive change is a testament to how much we believe our names dictate our reception in the world. While internal drivers like implicit egotism, the unconscious preference for things that remind us of ourselves, play a role in how we navigate the world, the Dorian Gray effect focuses on the external sculpting done by the community. We see this in the way social expectations can literally drive behavioral outcomes. The Ashanti people of Ghana provide a quintessential example of this through their tradition of naming boys after the day of the week they are born. The Ashanti believe that the day of birth dictates a child's character. A boy born on Monday is named Kwadwo and is expected to be mild-mannered and peace-loving. A boy born on Wednesday is named Kwaku and is expected to be violent and aggressive. When researchers analyzed the records of local juvenile courts, they found that the social sculpting was remarkably effective. The number of violent acts committed by boys named Kwaku was significantly higher than would be expected by chance, while the Monday-born Kwadwos lived up to their peaceful reputations. The community expected the Wednesday boys to be troublemakers, and through a lifetime of subtle and overt social feedback, the boys fulfilled that prophecy. The name was not just a label, it was a mold that the boys' personalities eventually grew to fill. A similar phenomenon has been observed in modern Western contexts through the research of David Figlio. He studied the life trajectories of boys given names that are traditionally perceived as girlish or feminine, such as Ashley, Shannon, or Courtney. Figlio found that these boys often perform well in school and exhibit typical behavior during their early years. However, a dramatic shift occurs in the 6th grade. As these boys enter middle school, a period of intense social pressure and gender role enforcement, the friction caused by their names leads to a significant spike in behavioral problems and disciplinary issues. The name becomes a source of social conflict, and the child's behavior is sculpted by the resulting stress and the need to assert an identity that contradicts their label. This link between names and behavior is also observed in the way names can act as a moral or social anchor. In Chinese research, individuals with names that were rated as high in warmth or morality were found to have a lower risk of being involved in criminal activity. This suggests that a positive name can foster a sense of social responsibility. The name acts as a quiet, persistent reminder of the person society expects you to be, guiding your moral compass and your interactions with your community. Conversely, when a name carries a negative or low-status stereotype, the individual may feel pushed toward the margins, leading to a higher risk of antisocial behavior, as they internalize the community's low expectations. The way names shape our social standing is also influenced by the cultural values of the society we live in. In cultures that value honor and reputation, such as in parts of the American South, there is a strong tradition of patronymic naming, where a son is given his father's first name. This practice is linked to a desire to pass down a legacy and a sense of duty to defend the family's reputation. A man who carries his father's name may feel a greater pressure to uphold the family status, leading to higher levels of aggression in response to perceived slights. In this context, the name is not just a label, it is a repository of family honor that must be protected, sculpting the bearer into a guardian of ancestral prestige. As we move into a more globalized and digital world, the psychology of names continues to evolve. We see this in the way people choose handles and aliases online, creating new identities that they then strive to inhabit. But the core principle remains the same. The names we are given are powerful organizing principles for our lives. They affect how we are graded in school, how we are treated by the law, and even how we physically age. The Dorian Gray effect reminds us that our identities are not static. They are dynamic processes shaped by the constant interaction between our names and the social world. This interplay of identity and expectation is so strong that it raises a fundamental question about the nature of the self. If our faces and our fates are being sculpted by the labels we carry, how much of our character is truly our own? Chapter 5. Breaking the Nominal Mold. While much of the conversation surrounding our names focuses on how they might pull us toward a specific destiny, there is an equally fascinating group of people who seem to exist in total defiance of their labels. These individuals represent a phenomenon that thinkers have called nominative contradeterminism, or, more simply, the inaptronym. This occurs when a person's name is in such stark, hilarious contrast to their actual life or profession that it feels like a deliberate act of rebellion against the universe's sense of irony. It reminds us that while a name may provide a subtle psychological nudge, the human spirit is perfectly capable of steering the ship in the opposite direction. The most famous example of this kind of nominative friction is undoubtedly the late Archbishop of Manila, whose name was Cardinal Sin. For a high-ranking official in the Catholic Church, a name that denotes the very thing he is tasked with combating is a masterpiece of contradiction. Rather than hiding from the irony, he famously leaned into it, often welcoming visitors to his palace with the line, "Welcome to the House of Sin." This kind of self-aware humor suggests that when a name is too loud to ignore, the bearer often uses it as a tool for connection rather than a script for their behavior. We see a similar dynamic in the professional world with individuals like Andrew Waterhouse. Given his surname, one might expect him to be a specialist in irrigation, or perhaps a professional swimmer. Instead, he became a renowned professor of wine. The leap from water to wine is not just a career choice, it is a linguistic reversal. Then there are those who find the weight of a name's irony too heavy to carry into certain professions. One would-be doctor, born with the surname Kill, realized that introducing himself as Dr. Kill might not instill the necessary confidence in his patients. To avoid the inevitable jokes and the potential for a PR nightmare, he chose to legally change his name to Jurgenson before beginning his medical practice. This is a conscious act of identity reinvention, a way of cutting the anchor of a name to allow for a different kind of professional growth. In some cases, the defiance is less about a funny coincidence and more about a refusal to be defined by a label that carries a negative social charge. Think of a police commissioner in a major city whose last name is Outlaw. Danielle Outlaw did not let the connotations of her name deter her from a career in law enforcement. In fact, she rose to the very top of the profession. By becoming the ultimate enforcer of the law, she effectively neutralized the irony of her name. It becomes a badge of distinction rather than a mark of distinction. This suggests that for some, a contradictory name can act as a catalyst for overachievement. You have to be so good at your job that the name becomes an afterthought. This sense of constant vigilance is a common experience for those with inaptronums. Consider an athlete who competes in obstacle course racing and happens to be named Trip Hurt. In a sport where falling and injury are the primary risks, a name like that is a headline waiting to happen. Every time he stumbles, the world is ready with a pun. To succeed under that kind of pressure requires a specific kind of mental toughness. You aren't just competing against the other runners, you are competing against the linguistic trap set by your own identity. Beyond the world of contradictions, there is the separate but related influence of rare and unique names. While a common name like John or Mary might help an individual blend into the social fabric, a truly rare name acts as a permanent spotlight. Psychologists have identified what they call a distinctiveness motive in people who carry unusual labels. From a very young age, these individuals are treated as unique because their names are one of a kind. This can foster a self-concept that is rooted in being different from the crowd. Research into the world of business has found that this sense of uniqueness often manifests in the boardroom. Chief executives with rarer names have been found to pursue more unconventional and distinctive business strategies. Because they have spent their lives being identified by a label that stands out, they are often more comfortable taking risks and moving away from the status quo. They don't feel the same pressure to conform to traditional industry standards because their very identity is an exercise in nonconformity. However, some experts argue that the name itself is not the primary driver of this creative success. They suggest that a rare name is often a passenger, a visible marker of a specific kind of family environment. Parents who choose to name their child something like Apple or Pancake are often individuals who value originality, curiosity, and independence. They are likely to raise their children in a home that encourages those same values. In this view, the child grows up to be a creative film director or an innovative CEO, not because of the name on their birth certificate, but because they were raised by the kind of people who would pick such a name in the first place. The name is the smoke, but the family culture is the fire. This brings us to one of the most remarkable stories of name-based defiance, a woman named Mariana Pepsi Van Dyke. Despite being given a name that many would consider a lifelong handicap, she refused to change it. She didn't just survive the social friction, she used it as the foundation for her life's work. She became an academic who specifically studied the impact of uncommon names on children's lives. She proved that a name that invites ridicule can be transformed into a source of immense personal power. Her mother had told her as a child that her name would take her around the world, and in a way, that prophecy came true through her academic success and public speaking. She represents the ultimate triumph of the individual over the label. The psychological drive to move away from a name can also be influenced by a person's level of self-esteem. Researchers have found that while people with high self-esteem are drawn to things that remind them of themselves, those with lower self-esteem may actually move away from self-related cues. If you don't have a positive association with your identity, you might subconsciously avoid careers or locations that share your initials. This suggests that nominative determinism is not a one-size-fits-all rule. It is a dynamic process that depends heavily on an individual's internal landscape. If the hum of self-attraction is replaced by a hum of self-doubt, the name-letter effect can actually work in reverse, pushing the person to seek out an identity that feels as different from their own as possible. We also see how the connotations of a name can shift due to external cultural forces, leaving the bearer to navigate a new and often difficult landscape. A name that felt perfectly neutral 20 years ago, like Karen or Donald, can suddenly become a cultural shorthand for a specific set of behaviors or political associations. The people carrying these names didn't change, but the world's reaction to their labels did. This can create a strange kind of social pressure where the individual feels they must constantly prove they are not the stereotype their name has become. It is a form of nominative determinism imposed from the outside, where the world tries to force the person into a mold they never asked for. This external pressure is even visible in our physical appearance. While some research suggests we grow to look like our names through a slow process of social mirroring, those with rare names often develop a physical presence that emphasizes their individuality. They might choose more distinctive grooming or fashion as a way of aligning their outward appearance with the uniqueness of their label. They are leaning into the role of the outsider or the innovator, using their name as a permission slip to be different. Even in the most traditional institutions, we find individuals who use their names as a way to reflect on the nature of their work. A vicar named Reverend Michael Vickers once suggested that rather than being drawn to the church by his name, he might have been influenced by a desire to escape the secular associations of his family's history. For him, the name was a reminder of a past he wanted to move beyond, and the choice of the clergy was a way to redefine what that name stood for. It shows that our names are not just destinations. They are often the starting points from which we define ourselves by either embrace or departure. Ultimately, whether we are leaning into the comfort of a name like Dennis or pushing back against the irony of a name like Outlaw, we are all in a constant negotiation with the labels we carry. Our names are the first gifts we receive, and they remain with us as we navigate the complex social world. They can be a tailwind that pushes us toward a fitting career, or a headwind that we must fight against to prove our true character. The stories of those who defy their names remind us that while the labels are given to us, the meaning we attach to them is something we create for ourselves through every choice we make and every path we choose to follow. From ancient proverbs to modern psychology, our journey through the world of nominative determinism reveals a profound tension between fate and free will. While statistics often debunk grand cosmic patterns, the subtle forces of implicit egotism and social expectation show that our names are more than mere labels. They are psychological anchors, quietly shaping our perceptions and paths. Whether we unconsciously lean into them or defiantly carve our own way, our names remain a foundational part of our identity. Ultimately, the power of a name lies not in predestining a life, but in highlighting the complex, beautiful negotiation between the self we are given and the self we choose to become. Thank you for listening.